Welcome to the Fear and Greed Daily Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. Governments across the country have committed a record $225 billion in infrastructure investments over the next couple of years. On top of that, more projects are being planned and delivered by the private sector. But a report out this week by Infrastructure Australia says infrastructure decision-making falls short of consistent best practice. The report calls for major reform of the sector to help address challenges like the risk of insolvency, cost overruns and project delays. Peter Colacino is the Chief of Policy and Research at Infrastructure Australia and my guest this morning. Peter, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Thank you so much for having me back on.
Where to start on infrastructure? It is so big. Let's start with who's responsible for infrastructure and has Australia got the mix right?
Yeah, look, that's a fantastic way to start because it is a point of real confusion for many people. And frankly, it's because it's confusing. So all three levels of government in Australia have some level of responsibility for infrastructure, both in terms of regulation and delivery. So the federal government, big focus on telecommunications, obviously a very large project under ownership and now operating network through the NBN. But they also have responsibility for interstate freight network, particularly international airports, but airport regulation broadly. States and territories generally are in the main thrust of things, though, across tens of thousands of kilometres of road and rail networks, ports. They have a direct role in regulating some air routes, provide public transport. So really the heavy lifters in many ways of big assets. But then local government owns everything from your local road to drainage, parks, community facilities. So with the lowest taxing potential, local government is generally regarded as the owner of the most disparate group of assets and carries a really large burden. So those local governments are often doing more with less. And we really see a big part of our role at Infrastructure Australia as supporting them to adopt best practice reform.
Okay, I mean, I'm just going to use the example in Queensland this week. There was a $1.8 billion infrastructure spend announced. It was announced by Scott Morrison, the Prime Minister. The Queensland government was there. There was a bunch of state governments there. There's also business, I think, putting in $70 million towards that $1.8 billion. It, of course, is in the lead in the next 10 years in the run-up to the Olympic Games in Brisbane. But that's sort of, is that typical, I suppose, where you have all three points of government as well as business coming together to try and get stuff done?
It's exceptionally rare is really something I'd underline. So that particular arrangement you're talking about, the South East Queensland City deal, came at the same time as an announcement of an injection of additional funding into the Perth City deal, which brings the collection of these three levels of government agreements to around 10 around the country. So we've got Western Sydney, Hobart, Launceston, Darwin, Townsville, and it's delivered everything from focus on bridges to stadia, right the way through to, as you say, preparing Southeast Queensland for the Olympics. And that model is a model that Infrastructure Australia supports strongly. It grew out of France. People often say it's an English model, but perhaps like a lot of good English things pinched from over the channel and deployed here with great success because, as you say, it's a way to get everybody to the table. And because of that mixed ownership of infrastructure, it really is critical to have all three levels of government at the table when you're talking about these big assets and integrating them into the community, which is often called placemaking.
Placemaking, righto. Let's get into the report and what you've found. One of the big long-term challenges in the sector always seems to be cost overruns. And we've seen that in the last few weeks. The Victorian group ProBuild, its infrastructure area seems to have caused it all sorts of problems and it had to call in administrators. How do you stop cost overrun? I mean, it must be so difficult to actually cost an infrastructure project up front because it is so big.
Well, so we undertook a report called the National Infrastructure Risk Study about 12 months ago now as part of a piece of work called Market Capacity that COAG and now National Cabinet asked us to undertake for all governments. And what we identified as part of that research is globally, 75% of transport projects run over budget.
Wow.
And if we were to make sure that every transport project was delivered within budget, we would need a contingency or reserve of funds 100% larger than the actual cost of delivering the project.
Right.
So with a record investment pipeline, as you mentioned earlier, 52 billion will be spent next year on really large projects across infrastructure. 80% of that spending is in transport, so 40 billion. We would need to, as the country, keep 40 billion in reserve to make sure we can cover cost overruns. And we're in a really interesting environment where we've got collapses of contractors, as you mentioned, ProBuild, but also Condev and Pindan, who are WA based. Knock-ons through the sector across school construction, hospitals. These are the types of assets or projects that those companies were involved with. And as a result of their collapse, you see pressure on the market for competition, you see difficulty with attracting skills, you see financial risk increasing for companies. And that's at a time where we've got continuing impacts from pandemic supply chain pressures. We've now got obviously conflict in the Ukraine, with the pressure that it puts, particularly around petroleum products, but a number of other areas that are required for instance, silicon chip production. And all of those pressures trickle through the sector, compounding those already existing risks that see 3 in every 4 transport projects run over budget.
Are we just... Why? I mean, that's an incredible statistic that you basically got to have twice as much money in the bank as you say up front. Is it just inevitable? Surely there must be some way of getting better at it.
Well, it's definitely not inevitable. And that's exactly what our report released this week, Delivering Outcomes, suggests. So what we see in Australia, and indeed what we see in some of our peers as countries, so we think about the UK, Canada, and New Zealand, particularly in an infrastructure sense, some really great projects, and some projects that are really great at different areas of their life cycle, but might fall away in later stages, or in fact might be a project that had to get back on track. So we see, for instance, in the level crossing removal program in Melbourne, really great focus on collaborative contracts. We see in Snowy 2.0, a federal government project, really good use of documents for alliance. So really technical geotech work, as it's called,
Yep.
Looking into how difficult tunnelling will be for Snowy Hydro 2.0. And the government has really done a great job there. We see Inland Rail looking at engaging Tier 2 contractors, another federal government project, or Sydney Metro, not in the most exciting of areas, but its legal contract work has really been exceptional.
Oh, Peter, please, that's exciting.
But on Metro, as an example, we heard this week that there's a significant cost overrun, so over $2 billion on the Southwest Metro. So, a project that's done really well in many areas, but facing pressures in others. And that's the story of the sector, this patchwork of performance. And our Delivering Outcomes report really looked globally and domestically, I have to say, at project leaders, and looked in parallel industries, or in fact, really diverse counterculture industries. So we engage with the US Defense Force and Flight Center and automotive manufacturers. And we came up with 7 principles that really can define better performance. So thinking about people and outcome-based delivery. So focusing, as we started this conversation, on the idea that infrastructure is designed to deliver services for people and for places rather than just concrete and steel.
Yeah. I think that's really critical. Everything you're talking about actually does affect we as a community, how we operate, how fast, the time it takes us to get to work, our ability to enjoy our leisure time, all that. Like, infrastructure is often thought of in the abstract, but it's actually all of our everyday lives.
Well, every time you turn on the tap or switch on a PowerPoint, or for that matter, glance at your mobile phone, of course, there's billions of dollars of infrastructure investment that's allowing that to occur. And we do have difficulties in providing high quality services in Australia, but generally our infrastructure networks are globally competitive. We have the largest electricity network in the world, the largest interconnected network. We have reliable water on the driest inhabitable continent. We have strong investment across our roads and public transport networks in our largest cities. But of course, we also have communities where we have challenges with access to housing. And our report, Regional Strengths and Infrastructure Gaps, last week called out access to housing as the biggest challenge for Australia's regions. But we also saw telecommunications struggling in many regions, issues around education and a range of other areas.
Stay with me, Peter. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Infrastructure Australia Chief of Policy and Research, Peter Colacino. Okay, so let's just get into benchmarking. So you talk about the need to benchmark. It just seems that every infrastructure project is unique, though. How do you benchmark?
Well, that's the trap that many people fall into, is this idea that either Australia's unique or their project's unique. In fact, the level of commonality is greater than the level of difference. So we talk about this benchmarking approach within the idea of thinking of infrastructure as a system. So a project or an asset doesn't stand alone. You know, a section of road is part of a broader road network, or an electricity power generator is part of the broader electricity grid. But also, the organisations that deliver infrastructure don't work by themselves. There are very few projects where a single organisation is capable of delivering it in total.
Yep.
So we really do need to think of the sector as a system, and benchmarking comes into play in that context, where we're trying to see that value for money is delivered on a project when contrast to, you know, the section of road around the corner or a rail line in another state or similar. So there's a growing approach, which in Australia we've really been leaders of through the resources sector, which is, and this is a bit of technical jargon, but it's called a should cost model. And as the name suggests, it gives you a sense of what the project should cost. If you were, for instance, laying railway track on flat ground, it will give you the context for that cost. And then you have an understanding of what your target should be in similar conditions on a similar project. So taking that approach from resources and applying it in infrastructure is a real priority.
Okay, you also talk about things shifting from the current combative contracting models to longer-term collaborative models, integrating supply chains, supporting the financial sustainability of the infrastructure industry by adopting principles of fair return in a market economy where everyone is trying to outcompete and outbid and governments are trying to keep costs down. How does that all work? How can you be more collaborative, actually be happy with a fair return rather than getting some excess return? Is that feasible?
It absolutely is feasible, and we've seen these sorts of approaches adopted in other sectors is a really important starting point. But what it requires is an open book approach. It requires contractors to be transparent with governments, with clients, about their financial performance and about risks. And it requires governments to be mature in recognising that contractors losing money, although it might deliver the lowest cost on a single project, ultimately reduces competition in the industry and builds cost into the next project. So in this notion of collaboration, we really point to the Project 13 principles, which have been pioneered in the UK as being best practice. And the types of things that it talks about are making sure that a project delivery team is integrated with representatives of the client, the designer, the builder, all sitting together in a team working to deliver a clear set of outcomes. It requires that engagement from client and contractor to be early, you know, before an environmental approval occurs. Quite useful to have the project planned and designed, but really importantly, it requires that change in relationships, as you've mentioned, because the infrastructure sector is highly competitive, which is good. We want to maintain competition. But that turns into a combative environment where litigation, variation, ultimately the court system and the processes built into that drives the industry. And all of that expense and all of that focus takes away from delivering good projects for people and places. So we need to see a mindset shift on both sides of the table. If it only occurs on one, then it won't lead to lasting reform. where we can drive this progress towards collaboration.
Peter, we have only scratched the surface in a very, very large sector, but we have run out of time, unfortunately. Thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you so much.
That was Infrastructure Australia Chief of Policy and Research, Peter Colacino. This is a Fear and Greed Daily interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, Australia's most popular business podcast. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.